Hello students, Mr. Rich here. We are in for our second AP World video of lecture. This one's going to be much shorter than the first one. This topic is Japan and then some other states in Southeast Asia. So we'll start with Japan. When we last left Japan in 1900, we know that Japan had successfully industrialized. They were the only non-Western society to do so. We know they support World War I, the Allies. They received some German territory as a thank you from that. But in the 1920s and 30s, they become increasingly militaristic. Japan was one of the societies we studied in our authoritarian activity a couple of weeks ago. They have a military dictatorship. They do have the emperor still, Emperor Hirohito. But he is a figurehead. He has no actual power, but we do believe that he is a god in Shintoism. So he is a symbol, and we talk about him, but he doesn't make any decisions. In fact, in 1931, when the Japanese invade Manchuria, after they blow up their own train tracks and then blame the Chinese for this, the first time the government finds out about it is after it's happened. The emperor is completely in the dark. He is not even informed. And we know this because he tells that story later on when he's trying to prove that he had nothing to do with some of the acts of World War II, and so they don't punish him for them. So anyway, that is the logic of that. Now, World War II, of course, we know the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor and then fight the United States in a gritty fight for 4 years across the islands of the Pacific Ocean, ultimately ending in the nuclear bombs on August the 6th and August the 9th on Hiroshima and Nagasaki of 1945. Those bombs, if you remember, in Hiroshima kill 70,000 to 80,000 instantaneously, 40,000 in Nagasaki, and then hundreds of thousands of people later on with cancer and birth defects and all sorts of medical problems. However, Japan had also been bombed by the Allies ever since Pearl Harbor, basically, for 3.5 years with traditional firebombs. Over 100,000 had been killed in Tokyo, for example, already before the end of the war. So Japan is in really bad shape at the end of the war. There is a peace treaty that is signed on September the 2nd, 1945 on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. And that is the beginning of a new Japan. Now, Japan is ruled for 5 years after the war by the United States. The United States is going to be an occupying force, and therefore we help write the Constitution of Japan. The Emperor of Japan has got to give up the status that he is a god. He has to publicly announce he's not a god, which has to be one of the more odd statements that a politician has ever made publicly. And the government is therefore going to be very similar to the United States. They have a constitution with separation of church and state. They will have a lot of the same freedoms in terms of elections, in terms of speech, etc. The one big difference is that it's thought that we should allow the emperor to remain because he is a tradition, he's a holdover, he's something for the people to look forward to and have pride in, and he will actually end up leading Japan, at least as a figurehead, until 1989. So he's going to have the same amount of power that Queen Elizabeth does in England or many other kings around the world that are symbolic. They have a philosophical meaning, they don't actually have any practical power. So the Constitution also says that because Japan had been an aggressor in World War II, they were not allowed to have an offensive military. Now, whatever that means. As defined by the Japanese Constitution, they cannot spend more than 1% of their gross domestic product on an offensive military. Now, what makes military offensive versus defensive? That's debatable, and there have been ways to skirt around that because they don't need a military, because we don't want them to have one after what they did in World War II, but also the United States increasingly interested in having a strong military presence in Asia, not too far from newly communist China or newly communist North Korea. So we provide military bases in Japan, which are still there today, not necessarily appreciated or wanted by the Japanese society currently, but that is where it is. Now, the other aspect of Japan, since they're not spending money on military, which is a huge part of the budget of most modern nations, they can spend their money on recovery. They will host the Summer Olympics in 1960, which is seen as a great symbol of their resurgence and the respect they receive. And when you think of the Japanese economy, which was the second in the world for decades, until it was overtaken by China just about a decade ago, the Japanese are associated with technology. Many great, powerful companies like Toyota, Mitsubishi, Nintendo, etc., etc., etc. We also have a massive pop cultural influence with anime and manga spreading from Japanese. And as, again, if we have a nation in the 21st century and time period 4 that has a massive pop cultural presence, we also know they're going to be a very wealthy and powerful country because your pop culture spreads because you have great influence and power in the world. So that is certainly true. Japan is not a great manufacturing state. They are what is called, they call it a knowledge economy. where they come up with ideas and productions and creativity. But that is the center of their economic resurgence, not necessarily producing goods, but coming up with the ideas for those goods. So it is still currently the third biggest economy in the world, even though it has been it stagnated a little bit. But it's remarkable for a small group of islands, and especially the utter destruction they faced in 1945, that they became one of the world's most powerful economic states. All right, a couple other examples in South and Southeast Asia. Vietnam. Vietnam was a French colony. The Japanese take it over in World War II. The French decide after World War II they want to take it back. The Vietnamese have very different ideas. Ho Chi Minh, who is the communist leader of what becomes North Vietnam. Vietnam was divided in half, basically kind of like the Koreans. And he was a guy who had been around in France for many years of the French colonial rule, and he was determined that we should have a system that provides for the poverty. Vietnam is very poor. They had had their resources exploited, much like we saw in much of Africa during the colonial period, and the French actually are going to get defeated by the Vietnamese in a battle in 1954. Now, the United States had been helping the French and advising the French because, again, we're concerned about what's called the domino theory, the spread of communism. China 1949, North Korea 1950 to 53, 1954, the Vietnamese defeat the French and then divide up as a communist North and a non-communist, but definitely not democracy either, South. And so we decided to send more and more advisors over the 1950s, and then in the 1960s really ramp it up. And then that's going to lead to the Vietnam War, which is a very famous conflict in the United States. It's a conflict where we're fighting an enemy who's literally fighting for survival. We don't really know why we're there. The average soldier does. It's kind of some vague anti-communism stuff. We don't really win because we take territory, we give it up. 2 days later, we have to take it again. We kill a lot of Vietnamese communists, but we don't get them to quit. And it just kind of, the public is going to be very much opposed to it. You'll talk about it quite a bit more next year in APWH, but eventually the United States will withdraw from Vietnam and we reunite as one single nation, which was communist for many, many years. Now, the United States is now friends with Vietnam. You can visit there as an American citizen. They are kind of like China in that they're a mixed economy. There's still elements of dictatorship there, absolutely, but they have a stock market and they have private corporations and that kind of thing. So they are not a communist nation still. Now, Vietnam's neighbor is Cambodia, and Cambodia also was a French colony, and the conflict in Vietnam spills into Cambodia during the 1960s and 70s. There was a communist revolution in Cambodia in the middle 1970s, and the guy who takes it over is called Pol Pot. Pol Pot is going to emulate Mao and Stalin. He is going to have his own cultural revolution in Cambodia. Cambodia is a small nation, only about 4 million people, 2 million people living in the capital city of Phnom Penh, and he is going to basically say, all of you intellectuals, you are the reason for our failures, much like Mao does in the Great Leap Forward. Of course, that didn't work. It ain't going to work in Cambodia either. We have a brutal, brutal conflict. You could be arrested for simply wearing glasses because that meant you wanted to correct your vision because you wanted to read. And reading sucks. And it makes you a nerd, and nerds cause a downfall of our society. So it's brutal. The Civil War is, we have an aspect called the killing fields, where we see, lots and lots of people killed, millions of people in a nation that didn't have a huge population in the first place. Torture and punishment, etc. So, and again, another aspect of proxy wars in the Cold War era. Cambodia and Vietnam are both examples of that. North Korea also, and Korea as well, also a proxy war. The division there, the South, again, not a democracy necessarily at first. They definitely are now a prosperous, modern, democratic nation with a capitalist economy. But in the 1950s and 60s, not so much. North Korea is one of the world's last communist states. They have concentration camps where they send people who oppose the government. It's a really brutal place, a tough place to live. So definitely some conflict there. There are no differences between North and South Koreans. That difference is only created geographically after World War II. So it is not a historic difference at all. There is no difference between that. The official philosophy of North Korea is called Juche. It literally means up yours. So it's a very anti-establishment, anti-American especially. They spend a lot of their money on nuclear weapons to justify themselves because the United States is going to get them. So a lot of different societies in that part of the world, but the main thing you should be aware of is the emergence of many Asian states as manufacturing centers in the modern economy. Places like Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, they're called the little tigers. Because they are small, but they produce quite powerful economies in the 1980s and 90s. So that's basically where we are there. We've talked a little bit about Indonesia, which is the world's most populous Muslim state, also a democracy. Former Dutch colony becomes independent after World War II. So there's not a whole lot to talk about the rest of Southeast Asia. We really don't get into Australia a whole lot. So just a little bit about Japan and the overview there.